Hey everybody, it is Professor Parish. I hope y'all have had a good break with the snow. Hopefully y'all haven't had to travel and drive out in this. But we're going to talk about Module 5 for English 123. We're going to talk about the poetry section today. So if you scroll on down here, hopefully I'm recording this on Saturday. So if you've not turned in paper 1, that was your only assignment this last week. It's a big assignment. It's worth basically a 10th of your grade. So make sure you get that paper turned in. You will get a chance to revise it. I want to talk about that in this. My goal this coming week, in week 5, is to grade your papers. And then after that, you'll pretty much have 2 weeks to revise. So once I get your paper back this week, you'll have week 6 and week 7 to revise it. And your revisions will be due, I'm pretty sure Module 7 will talk about it, but your revisions will be due around the end of February. So if you turn your paper in, and we'll talk next week about revisions, but if you turn your paper in, let's say you get a B on it, let's say you get like an 85 and you're like, no, I want an A, then you'll have a couple weeks to revise it and then resubmit it via email. So when you get your paper back with the grade, you'll get to turn it back in via email. If you have questions about revision, I'm going to talk next week about how to revise. I'm going to go over that in the lecture video once I have all the papers graded. But, and if you're asking, should I revise? If you get an A on this paper, no, I don't think you should revise. Unless you're a perfectionist and you really want to try to get that 100 points, then if you get an A on the paper, I wouldn't worry about it. And it depends on you as a student. If you're happy with the B and you want to stick with it, that's fine. I do tell students if they get a C or lower on a paper, I often suggest that they revise. If you get an A or a B, I think it's fine. I think that you'll be okay with that in the class. But if you're wanting an A, then obviously revise if you get a B. But if you get a C or lower, I do recommend that you revise, just because we are a little limited in points in this class. So I want you to get an A or B in the course. So definitely make sure you revise if you get lower than a B. But if you get a B, it's your prerogative. And if you get an A, I don't think you need to revise. But that's just me. You can revise if you want to. But hopefully I'll get those papers back to you early on in the week with your first paper. So there is that. But let's talk about this week. This week is just introducing poetry and introducing the next paper that we're doing. So I've got in our weekly readings here, I did add an article that I wanted to add to this. So poetry, I try to organize this class. I didn't want to do all of our fiction first and then all of our poetry, because some people like poetry, some people don't. So I try to sprinkle in, we do fiction, nonfiction, and then we do poetry, then we do short story again, and then we do poetry again, and then our final project. So you kind of get, and I like that because I think the first time around, when you write a story, you write poems, when you come back to it a second time around, you maybe learned a little bit more about yourself as a writer. We've talked a little bit more about different things and strategies. We've read a little bit more. So then you come back to it and you kind of have a fresher perspective. So we want to just get poetry out of the way now. I feel like people either really like poetry or they hate it. It's usually like a love-hate relationship. And I like poetry, but I say that, but I'm definitely more of a short story person. I wrote poetry in high school. I think a lot of people wrote poetry in high school because it's a way to express emotionality. And a lot of people use poetry as therapy. They use writing as therapy. So poetry is so emotional and it can be so intimate that it's easy to look to poetry to find a way to express yourself and to get emotions out quickly. Because when you think about it, poetry can be long, it can be short. There's a lot more freedom, I think, with poetry than with short stories, because poetry is not so tied down to the structure of fiction and nonfiction. A story has to have certain elements, and we've talked about that in the prior weeks. It has to have a plot. It has to have characters. It has to have a setting. Poetry doesn't have to have anything. Poetry is very free. You can make it as structured as you want. You can have rhyme schemes. You can make it a sonnet. You can have couplets. You can do all sorts of crazy structuring and stuff with the formatting and the poetry and the pattern and the wording. Or you cannot. And it's still poetry. So that's kind of it's sort of a great thing for some people, because they're like, you can feel very liberated by poetry. But if you're like me and you like that structure and it helps you to organize, poetry can be very daunting, because you think, okay, I'm getting into writing these poetries. I don't have to do anything. What? And it can be overwhelming. And I think and there's different types of poetry. Some people like nature poetry that's just writing about describing objects and imagery. I think a lot of people get thrown off by more abstract poetry where it's just talking about themes and moods, and people are like, I need to know what it's telling me. And a lot of times poets are like, you figure it out. So I think that throws some people off. And poetry can also leave you without a sense of closure. A lot of people don't like poetry because they think, okay, well, what was the point of this poem? Why did it end? What was the resolution? And sometimes poets are like, there is no resolution. And it can be very abstract. And I think a lot of people resent it for that. But others think that that's great. They're like, this is where I thrive. And so it really, I think poetry can be viewed depending on your personality and how you connect with literature as a person. I'm not the biggest fan of poetry, if I'm honest, but I do have an appreciation for it. So I tell my English 122 class, I'm like, we have a poetry section, and I say, my goal is not to make you love poetry. I can't make you love anything, but my goal is to make you at least respect and appreciate poetry, and then you don't have to like it if you don't want to. So that's kind of the situation here. I want us to write poetry and experiment with it, and I think it's fun to experiment, but you don't have to be married to it. You don't have to really love it if you don't. So obviously the lecture video for this week is what you're supposed to watch, but I included this article on poetry exercises because I have had students in the past ask about exercises. And unfortunately, most of the sites that I tried to find wanted you to buy a book or buy a class, and I'm not going to make you do that. But I did find this thing from Read Poetry that talks about just some simple exercises to get you started. So if you are someone that has not really wrote poetry and you're like, I feel nervous going into this, these are some exercises I think will help. And the reading responses and things we do in this class later on, I think will help as well. But ideas like, okay, personal history can be a way to start a poetry, like look up history around you, and that'll kind of give you like a context of where to start with a poem. I like blackout poems. I did this exercise in creative writing classes in college. I really like the blackout poem. It's where you start with a block of text from anywhere, and then you underline some of your favorite words, and then you form a poem based on the words that you liked. Because poetry essentially is writing at its finest. It's language at its best. Because to craft a good poem, you have to, as an author, as a poet, consider what words do I want to use, what words work best, what words convey the emotionality, the imagery that I want to best. And with fiction and short stories, you can be wordy and fluffy, and Charles Dickens was paid by the word. So his works are very verbose. They are very lengthy and over detailed and specific. And I'm not a big Dickens fan because of it. I just, when I read A Christmas Carol, I'm like, get to the point. So, but with poetry, you really can't afford to be wordy because poems are not long unless you're writing like a ballad. Poems are usually very short. So you have to consider what words you use in the moment and how are those words going to be effective in conveying your purpose and your theme. So the blackout poem is cool because you are picking the words that you like most, and then you're using those to construct a poem. So it is a fun exercise. If you want to challenge yourself, I would say do a blackout poem and then just see where it takes you. It's a nice exercise, and it's very outside the box, so to speak. You can make metaphors or similes. Metaphors and similes are great. Most poetry connect to them. We have the term extended metaphor, where a poem is completely based around a metaphor. And so if you have something like all the world's a stage, you can base a poem on that phrase and then maybe expand upon it. Poems can have themes. They can have narratives. Poems can have a story to tell. And so you can take a metaphor and expand it into a poem. And it can be really effective. Obviously, sensory observations, talking about your 5 senses like sight, taste, smell, touch, hearing, audio. You can connect all those senses into creating poetry. That's probably the easiest thing to do, or finding like a smell or a sight or a sound and making that the center of your poem. That's a good exercise. I love alliteration. Alliteration is one of my favorite things. I'm always drawn to, when people are like, how do I create a title for my story? I'm like, go with alliteration. It's the easiest exercise because you're just finding phrases or words that have similar sounds. So you could be like, Peter Piper's picked peppers, like something like that. It's fun because I like connecting words and the sounds together, and it makes it very poetic, basically. But that you can use alliteration to help create the start of a poem, right? And I'd say it's a good exercise if you're trying to create a title for your work as well. Synonym lists, you can get different synonyms and use that to help you create effective poetry. If you've ever wrote a haiku, if you're writing a haiku, you are limited on the number of words and syllables you can use. So knowing synonyms is really important, because if you're trying to say a word multiple times and you don't want to keep using the same word, synonyms are a great alternative to that. And then I like these last two. So one is imagining you're someone else, and that can kind of put you in the headspace of another character, another writer, and writing like them. I had a student one time that kind of did this. They wrote their poetry from the perspective of like Edgar Allan Poe, and I thought that was really cool because they like basically wrote as if Edgar Allan Poe was writing, and I was like, oh, okay. Because you kind of, if you have an author or poet that you really like, then you can kind of get into their headspace and write as if they would write. And that takes some pressure off of you, right? Because I think a lot of people get intimidated by poetry. They're thinking, oh, well, I don't want my own thoughts and stuff out there because I don't think they're good. They are good, first and foremost. But if you're someone that really doesn't want to do that, putting yourself in another author's shoes and writing from their perspective, it alleviates some of that pressure on yourself, and it allows you to be creative without having to worry about it. So that's really good. And then recycling, taking poems that you like or that you've read and drawing inspiration from them. Now, obviously, don't copy them word for word because that will be obvious. But if you like some of Shakespeare's poetry and you want to draw inspiration from it, absolutely. I mean, imitation is the highest form of flattery. And a lot of authors reference each other and draw inspiration from each other, and they just tweak things and make it their own. And I definitely encourage you to do that, especially if you're someone that's not written a lot of poetry before. Go with the basics, go with the classics. Look at the poems that are in our textbook, and if one of them strikes you, then try to rewrite it in your own way and change something about it. Change the wording, change the theme, but write it in your own way. So I think this article has some good ideas. And so if you're struggling to get started, I think these are good exercises to get you going and finding a new way to do something. So with that being said, I want to talk about the paper 2 guideline that was in our module, as well as the assignment for this week. So the paper 2 guidelines are right here. So this second paper is all about poetry. So you are asked to create a poem and analyze that poem. So you're not only going to write a poem, but you're going to break it down, because I think it's important that you show. It's kind of like if you were in geometry in high school and you had to do a proof. I hated proofs, to be honest. I'm not a math person. I'm an English person, so other side of the brain. But I remember with proofs, you have to explain why you did what you did, right? This paper's kind of like that. It's I hope it sounds more fun than doing proofs. Doing proofs sounds like the most painful thing in the world right now. But the idea is that you're going to create a poem and then explain your reasons behind creating that poem and what it means, right? So you're giving me an analysis of your own work, which sounds easy, but it will be a little bit of a challenge because you got to find a way to articulate why you did what you did. So your poem should have the following. The poem that you write should have a distinct style or genre. So it can be haiku, it can be open form, it can be a sonnet. It has to have a distinct genre. It needs to have imagery or descriptive details. It has to have a sense of theme or purpose. And it has to be at least half a page, or 3 distinct stanzas. If you're doing haikus, then I basically want you to make 3 haikus, because haikus are very short. If you're doing vignette poems, they're very short. So if you're doing a flash poem or a haiku, I want you to do 3 of them, because they're very short anyway. But if you're just doing a regular poem, depending on the genre, then they need to have at least 3 verses. All right, at least taking up half the page. Okay, you can format these poems however you want to. You can make the font as big as you want to, as long as there's 3 verses. You can make the font as big as you want. You can organize it however you like. You can make it look cool. I've had a student do a poem that looked like a wave, like it was just, or like steps. It was just organized a certain way on the page. You can be creative in that regard however you want to be. It just needs to be at least 3 verses long and have a sense of theme. I don't want you getting too abstract with this first poem. Maybe when we get to the second paper on poetry, you can get a little more abstract. But I want this one to have a concrete theme and purpose and imagery and descriptive details. I want us to start with the basics, and then you can get crazy later, right? So along with the poem, you'll do a short analysis explaining the choices that you made with this poem. The analysis should be formatted as listed below and include the following details. So your analysis needs to be at least 2 full pages. So 2 full pages of analysis on your poem or poems if you do haiku or flash poetry. The font should be 12-point, double-spaced. Don't do hard to read or enlarged fonts, obviously. Margins should be 1 inch. Your analysis needs to have an introduction and a conclusion. It should discuss the choices that you made, why you made these decisions, whether it be rhyme scheme, genre, themes. I want you to break down your poem like line for line, beat for beat, and explain to me why you did what you did. Now, people have asked about where to put the poem. I would say start with your poem on page 1. Either do your poem at the beginning or the end of your paper. I've had some students that started with their analysis and they explained their entire poem, and at the very end they included their poem. You can do that. I've had other students do the poem at the beginning and then the analysis. It's up to you. I just want to know, I want the poems to be in a distinct spot where I can see them, and I want your analysis to be in a distinct spot where I can see it. So that's basically it. And any sources that you reference outside of your own personal knowledge should be cited in MLA. So if you reference a poetry book, if you reference a textbook or something, you need to cite it in MLA on a separate page. Okay? Pretty simple, right? And so then, yeah, here's how it's going to be graded. Your analysis and conclusion has points dedicated to it. Standard American English, grammar and mechanics, the formatting, the creativity and effort. That seems like a very broad range of points, but basically if I can see you put forth some effort, you didn't just slap some words on the page and call it poetry, you're going to get those 20 points. I mean, this is a creative writing class, yes, but it's also a work in progress class. Like, we're all learning as writers. So I'm not going to judge you harshly on those 20 points. If you show you tried, then I'm going to know and give you those points. And then your analysis is accessible and the content is appropriate. So 100 points, basically like our fiction, nonfiction paper. So that's the guidelines that are on there, and you'll be able to see, I'm going to go back to the homepage and show you all that module where you can see it. But yeah, down here, you can see the guidelines are right here. And so then, yeah, then there is our topic and outline. So very similar to what you did for the fiction paper. I would like for you to tell me your thesis statement, saying what kind of poem. I want to know what kind of poem are you writing? Are you doing haikus? Are you doing a sonnet? Are you doing an open form? Are you doing like a ballad, whatnot? What kind of poems are you doing? How many are you doing? Are you doing just 1 3-verse poem? Are you doing like multiple haikus? What you doing? What are they going to be about? Do you have and it could be a broad theme. You can be like, oh, I'm going to write poetry about my dog. Simple. You'd be like, oh, I'm going to write a poem about a breakup, or I'm going to write a poem about high school. I'm going to write a poem about COVID. You know, you can do whatever you want. That's fine. And then as far as the outline goes, with poetry, it's hard to outline. So what I kind of want to know is, this is going to be very bare bones, very skeletal. I just want to know, as a poem, how are you thinking about structuring it? Is it going to tell a story? Are you thinking like each verse, what is each verse going to do? Like in a poem, you could have like the first verse is going to outline the object I'm talking about. The second verse is going to talk about the theme. And the third verse is going to wrap it all up. Like, it can be very, very simple. I'm not looking for anything crazy with the outline because it's poetry. And also, I want you to view this assignment as a way that if you have questions about poetry, you can also ask those as well. So include in your thesis and outline, if you have questions for me about this assignment, also talk about them there, and I'll be happy to answer in my feedback any questions that you have. And that's due by Sunday. So yeah, that's basically the assignment for this week. It's just working on that outline, figuring out what you want to write about poetry. Over the next couple weeks, I'm going to have a few more. I'll try for Module 6 to have it's going to open up tomorrow, but I'm going to try to have for Module 6 some examples of terminology with poetry to help you if you're wondering about that. But yeah, I may copy some pages from our English 122 textbook because they have some really good stuff on poetry. But yeah, if you have questions in the meantime, please let me know. If you've not turned in paper 1, get that done this weekend. It's due Sunday, and it's worth a lot of points. If you don't turn anything in, you just get a big fat 0. If you do turn something in, then you'll get a chance to revise, even if it's not perfect. So if you have questions, let me know. But otherwise, I hope y'all are staying warm. I hope y'all are staying safe. And in the meantime, I'll get back to y'all next week with Module 6 of English 123. Bye.